Have you ever visited a mental asylum and discovered that the patients are actually running the show? How could a supposedly advanced system of treatment turn into a chaotic nightmare? Welcome to Classic Storytime Hub. Tonight's tale is The System of Dr. Tarr and Professor Fether by Edgar Allan Poe, a classic tale reimagined and retold for the modern age.
It was the autumn of 18, and my travels had carried me deep into the southernmost provinces of France. My route unexpectedly brought me close to a notorious private asylum, what the Parisians called a Maison de Santé. I had heard stories of it from medical acquaintances back in Paris, stories that were as chilling as they were fascinating. Never having set foot in such a place, I felt a thrill at the thought of seeing it for myself. I suggested to my traveling companion, a gentleman I had met only a few days prior, that we detour for an hour and explore the establishment. He hesitated. "I must press on," he said, "and truthfully, I have an aversion to seeing the insane." But he smiled faintly and added that I shouldn't let his fears deny me the curiosity I so clearly craved. He would ride ahead, giving me the chance to catch up later, or at least the following day. As he mounted his horse and bid me farewell, a thought struck me. Gaining entry might prove difficult. Without a letter of introduction or a personal acquaintance with the superintendent, Monsieur Maillard, access could be denied. My companion nodded knowingly and offered a compromise. He had met Maillard years before and would escort me to the door, though he himself would not cross the threshold. His unease with lunacy, he confessed, made the idea unbearable. Grateful for his guidance, I turned off the main road onto a narrow, overgrown path. Within half an hour, the trail vanished into a dense forest draping the base of a looming mountain. The shadows of twisted trees and the smell of damp earth pressed around me as I rode nearly 2 miles through the gloom. Then, through the misty trees, the asylum appeared. It was a bizarre, crumbling chateau, ancient, decayed, almost uninhabitable from years of neglect. Its strange silhouette struck a shiver into my heart. I drew my horse to a halt, a fleeting desire to flee rising within me. But shame and curiosity won over fear, and I pressed forward, each step drawing me closer to whatever secrets lay within those eerie walls. As we approached the gate, I noticed it slightly ajar and a man's face peering out from the shadow within. In an instant, he stepped forward, calling my companion by name, grasping his hand warmly and urging him to dismount. It was Monsieur Maillard himself. He was a broad-shouldered, imposing gentleman, polished and composed, exuding a natural air of dignity and authority that immediately commanded respect. After a brief introduction, my friend explained my desire to tour the asylum. Maillard assured me that I would be given every attention, and with that, my companion rode off, disappearing down the forest path, leaving me alone with the enigmatic superintendent. Maillard led me into a small parlor that was remarkably tidy and refined. Books lined the shelves, delicate drawings adorned the walls, pots of blooming flowers softened the corners, and musical instruments hinted at a cultivated taste. A cheerful fire crackled in the hearth, throwing warm light across the room. At the piano sat a young woman, strikingly beautiful, singing a Bellini aria. Her voice was soft, almost haunting, and she paused mid-song to greet me with quiet, graceful courtesy. There was a subtle sadness in her eyes, a pale elegance that stirred in me a mix of curiosity, respect, and admiration. She was clad in deep mourning, yet her presence was commanding without effort. I had heard rumors in Paris about Maillard's asylum, whispers of a system of soothing, where punishments were avoided, confinement was rare, and patients enjoyed remarkable freedom under careful observation. Many roamed the house and gardens dressed as any sane person might, their apparent liberty masking the ever-watchful supervision behind the scenes. With these thoughts in mind, I chose my words carefully around the young woman. I could not be certain of her sanity. There was a restless sparkle in her eyes that made me hesitate. So I spoke only of neutral, harmless topics, safe matters that would neither excite nor offend, should she indeed be one of the asylum's enigmatic residents. She answered every question of mine with perfect rationality, and even her spontaneous remarks revealed keen intelligence. Yet my experience with the peculiar reasoning of the insane had taught me caution. Such evidence of sanity could be deceptive. I maintained the same careful, measured tone throughout our conversation, wary not to reveal too much or provoke anything unpredictable. Soon a smartly dressed footman entered, carrying a tray of fruit, wine, and other refreshments. I partook of them while the young woman excused herself, leaving the room with quiet grace. My eyes instinctively turned toward my host, seeking an explanation. "No," he said gently. "She is a member of my family, my niece, and a remarkably accomplished woman." "I beg your pardon for even thinking otherwise, but you must understand that, having heard of the management of this house in Paris, one might imagine—" Yes, say no more," he interrupted kindly. "It is I who should thank you for your prudence. We rarely encounter visitors who exercise such forethought. In the past, under my former system, patients had greater freedom to roam the house and grounds, and thoughtless or unwary guests sometimes provoked dangerous frenzies. That is why I had to adopt strict exclusion. No one was admitted whose judgment could not be relied upon." I repeated his words, curiosity pricking at me. "Your former system? Do you mean that the soothing system I have heard so much about is no longer in effect?" He shook his head with a faint sigh. "Yes, several weeks ago we abandoned it entirely. We found it, frankly, too hazardous. The so-called advantages of the soothing system were vastly overrated. It was tried here to the fullest extent that rational humanity could conceive, and yet the risk it posed was always alarming. I regret that you did not visit earlier to see it in action for yourself. You are familiar, I presume, with the principles of the soothing method, its details and philosophy?" "Not entirely. What I've heard has always been second or third hand," I admitted. "My explanation, then, will be in general terms. It was a system of indulgence. We humored the patients. Every fancy that took hold of their minds we encouraged. Strange as it sounds, many of our lasting cures came from this very method. There is no argument that pierces the fragile reason of a madman quite like the argumentum absurdum. Take, for instance, those who believed themselves to be chickens. The cure? We insisted it was true, challenged the patient for not recognizing the fact, and, here's the clever part, limited his diet for a week to what a chicken would eat, a little corn and gravel. The results were astonishing." "But surely that wasn't all?" I asked. "By no means," he replied. "We relied heavily on simple amusements, music, dancing, light exercise, cards, certain books. Each patient was treated as though suffering a common physical ailment. The word lunacy never crossed our lips. A crucial tactic was to make each patient observe and check the behaviors of the others. To trust a madman, to rely on his understanding, flawed as it may be, is to win him over completely. This allowed us to maintain order without a large staff of keepers." "And no punishments at all?" "None," he said firmly. "And you rarely confined anyone?" "Only in extreme cases. If a patient's madness surged to a crisis, or he became dangerously violent, he was placed in a secret cell, hidden from the others, until he could be safely discharged to friends. Beyond that, the raging lunatic was sent to public hospitals. We dealt with reason, not fury." "And now you've abandoned all of this? You think it's for the better?" "Absolutely. The system, though clever, carried hidden dangers. Its advantages were often overrated. We've finally discarded it, happily, across all the Maison de Santé in France. "I must admit," I said, "I am thoroughly surprised by what you tell me. I had assumed that no other treatment for mania existed anywhere in the country." "You are still young, my friend," he replied with a gentle smile, "but one day you will learn to judge for yourself without relying on the gossip of others. Believe nothing you hear and only half of what you see. As for the Maison de Santé, clearly someone has misled you. But after dinner, when you've recovered from your ride, I will gladly take you through the house and introduce you to a system which, in my opinion, and in the opinion of all who have witnessed it, is unrivaled in its effectiveness." "Your own invention, then?" I asked, intrigued. "I am proud to claim it as mine, at least in part." Thus our conversation continued for an hour or two, as Monsieur Maillard showed me the gardens and conservatories, lush with autumnal blooms and carefully tended greenery. The air carried a faint, soothing fragrance, a sharp contrast to the uneasy anticipation that clung to me. "I cannot show you the patients just yet. For a sensitive mind, such a sight can be more shocking than one expects. I would not spoil your appetite for dinner. Let us dine first. I shall have veal à la Menehoult with cauliflowers in velouté sauce, followed by a glass of Clos de Vougeot. Then your nerves will be suitably steadied." At 6, dinner was announced. My host led me into a grand salle à manger, where a large assembly had gathered, 25, perhaps 30 guests. They were evidently people of rank, their bearing and manners refined, though their attire struck me as extravagant, leaning toward the ostentation of the old court. 2/3 at least were ladies, and some wore ensembles that would, in Paris, be considered slightly eccentric or outdated. As I observed them, a subtle sense of unease crept over me. Something about the scene, its lavishness, its strange mixture of elegance and eccentricity, hinted that all was not quite as it seemed. Yet the warmth of the fire, the laughter of the company, and the polite chatter offered a deceptive comfort, masking the mystery I was soon to confront. Many of the women were startling in appearance. Some, clearly no younger than 70, were adorned with layers of rings, bracelets, and earrings, their bosoms and arms boldly exposed. Their dresses, if dresses they could be called, were mostly ill-fitting, ill-made, or both, lending an air of eccentricity to the entire gathering. In the midst of this curious spectacle, I spotted the young woman I had met in the parlor. My surprise was immediate. She was dressed in an outrageously antiquated fashion, a hoop skirt and farthingale, high-heeled shoes and Brussels lace cap far too large for her head, shrinking her delicate face into near comical proportions. Where she had once worn elegant morning attire, she now appeared a figure of playful absurdity, yet there was something oddly charming in the contrast. At first, I wondered if Monsieur Maillard had intended some subtle trick, perhaps allowing me to dine in the company of the insane, only to reveal the truth afterward. But as I looked closer, and as I conversed briefly with several of the guests, my apprehensions melted away. The southern provincialists, I reminded myself, were known for their peculiarities and antiquated tastes. What seemed eccentric at first glance was merely custom and local fashion. The dining room itself was spacious and comfortable, but far from ornate. The floor was bare, no carpet, and the windows, unadorned, were protected by iron-barred shutters, fastened diagonally like those of a shop. The room occupied an entire wing of the chateau, with windows on 3 sides and the door on the 4th, totaling 10 apertures in all. Despite the bare furnishings, the room exuded a quiet, understated charm, and I settled into my place with a mixture of curiosity and relief, ready to observe the dinner and the mysteries it might reveal. The dining table was a spectacle beyond imagination, groaning under a mountain of silver, piled high with meats, fruits, and delicacies. The abundance was almost barbaric in its extravagance. There was enough food to have fed the Anakim themselves. Never in my life had I seen such lavish waste, a feast of epic proportions. Yet, despite the bounty, there seemed little thought given to taste or arrangement. My eyes, accustomed to softer light, were nearly blinded by the unrelenting glare of countless wax candles, each perched in silver candelabra around the table and scattered wherever space permitted. Several attentive servants moved briskly among the guests, and at the far end of the room a small troupe of musicians, fiddles, fifes, trombones, and a drum, tried their best to produce music. To me, it sounded more like chaos than harmony, a cacophony that seemed to delight everyone else while testing my patience at every turn. Overall, I could not deny the strangeness of it all. Everything about the scene teetered on the edge of the bizarre. But then, the world is filled with every manner of person, with every sort of taste, habit, and eccentric custom. Having traveled widely, I'd grown adept at taking the unusual in stride. So I seated myself calmly at the right hand of my host, determined to enjoy the meal, and with a good appetite I did full justice to the feast before me. The conversation was lively and varied. The ladies, as is often the case, held the floor with ease and animation, while my host, a reservoir of good-humored anecdote, regaled us with stories from his life. To my surprise, the subject of lunacy was a favorite topic, and every tale, though often whimsical or absurd, revealed the strange and charming peculiarities of the patients. I found myself laughing, sometimes incredulously, at the bizarre antics described, yet unable to shake the feeling that something more uncanny lay beneath the surface. "We once had a fellow here," said a plump little gentleman to my right, who fancied himself a teapot. Remarkable, isn't it, how often this particular notion takes root in the mind of the insane? Nearly every asylum in France could provide a human teapot. Our gentleman was a fine Britannia-ware model, and made it a point to polish himself every morning with buckskin and whiting. And then, added a tall man sitting opposite, we had another who believed himself a donkey, which, allegorically speaking, was not entirely inaccurate. A troublesome patient indeed. For weeks he ate nothing but thistles. We soon remedied that, insisting he consume nothing else. Then came the perpetual kicking of heels, like so. "Mr. de Kock, I must insist you behave yourself," interrupted an elderly lady beside him. "Keep your feet to yourself. You've ruined my brocade. Is it really necessary to demonstrate your point in quite such a practical manner? Our friend here surely comprehends without the theatrics. Honestly, you're nearly as much a donkey as the unfortunate patient you describe. Your performance is uncannily accurate." "Mille pardons, mademoiselle," said Monsieur de Cook, bowing low and kissing his hand with exaggerated ceremony. "I meant no offense. Mademoiselle Laplace, Monsieur de Cook will have the honor of taking wine with you." He seated himself gracefully, and the two clinked glasses in a delicate toast, the absurdity of the scene mingling with the elegance of the gesture. "Allow me, mon ami," said Monsieur Maillard, turning to me with a polite smile, "to offer you a morsel of this veal à la Saint-Ménehoul. You will find it particularly exquisite." At that very moment, 3 burly waiters managed with some effort to place an enormous dish upon the table. At first glance, it appeared to be a grotesque monstrosity, monstrum horrendum informe ingens qui lumen ademptum, as my mind flitted to Latin horrors. But on closer inspection, it was merely a small roasted calf, arranged upright on its knees with an apple in its mouth, much like the English do with a hare. "No, thank you," I said politely. "To be honest, I'm not particularly partial to veal à la what-is-it. It doesn't entirely agree with me. Perhaps I'll switch plates and try some of the rabbit." Several side dishes held what seemed to be ordinary French rabbit, a delicate morsel I could recommend without hesitation. "Pierre," called my host,
Change this gentleman's plate and give him side of rabis au chat." "This what?" I asked, eyebrows raised. "This rabis au chat," he repeated. "Ah, well, thank you, but on second thought, no. I'll just take some ham instead." I thought to myself, one can never be certain what one is actually eating at the tables of these provincial eccentrics. I'll have none of their rabis au chat, or their cat au rabbit, for that matter.
"And then," continued a cadaverous gentleman near the foot of the table, picking up the conversation mid-thought, "we once had a patient who firmly believed himself to be a Cordova cheese, parading about with a knife in hand, offering slices from the middle of his leg to any willing friend." "He was a great fool indeed," interjected another, "but not half so singular as a certain individual, known to all but this strange gentleman here, who fancied himself a bottle of champagne. Always he went off with a pop and a fizz, just like so." Laughter and chatter rippled through the room, a bizarre harmony of amusement and absurdity. Yet beneath it all, a subtle unease lingered in my mind, an inkling that the real spectacle, the secret at the heart of this dinner, was yet to be revealed. At this point, the gentleman rose to demonstrate his tale. With a flourish that struck me as rude, he pressed his right thumb into his left cheek, withdrew it with a sharp pop, and then, with a dexterous flick of his tongue against his teeth, produced a long, sharp hissing and fizzing sound, an uncanny imitation of champagne frothing in a glass. Monsieur Maillard's brow tightened slightly at the display, but he said nothing, allowing the conversation to continue, now taken up by a lean little man wearing an enormous wig. And then there was an ignoramus who fancied himself a frog, a creature, I might add, to which he bore no small resemblance. You should have seen him, sir. His airs were perfectly natural. If that man was not a frog, it is truly a pity he wasn't. His croak, o-o-o-g, o-o-o-g, was exquisite, B-flat to a hair. And when he rested his elbows on the table, lifted his mouth, rolled his eyes, and winked them with astounding rapidity, after a glass or two of wine, of course, why, sir, I am compelled to say you would have been lost in admiration of the sheer genius of the performance. "I have no doubt of it," I replied, trying to conceal my growing amusement. "And then," added another, "there was Petit Gaillard, who fancied himself a pinch of snuff. He was genuinely distraught that he could not pinch himself between finger and thumb. And then Jules de Soulière, a singular genius, who believed himself a pumpkin. He relentlessly pestered the cook to transform him into pies, an indignity which the cook naturally refused. For my part, I cannot help but think a pumpkin pie à la de Soulière might have been quite the culinary delight." "I astonish me," I exclaimed, glancing at Monsieur Maillard with a mixture of incredulity and curiosity. He, meanwhile, remained composed, his face betraying only the faintest trace of irony, as though to say, "All in good order here. Or is it?" "Ha, ha, ha!" shouted one gentleman, his laughter bouncing off the walls. "He, he, hi, hi, hi! Ho, ho, ho! Hoo, hoo, hoo! Quite excellent! Do not be astonished, mon ami. Our friend here is a wit, a true droll. You must not take him literally. It is all in jest." And then another voice piped up. There was Buffon Legrand, an extraordinary creature indeed. He fell mad through love and fancied himself possessed of two heads. One he declared to be that of Cicero, the other a bizarre composite, Demosthenes from the forehead to the mouth, and Lord Brougham from the mouth to the chin. Perhaps he was mistaken, but he would have convinced you otherwise, for he was a man of remarkable eloquence. A true devotee of oratory, he could not resist a performance. At dinner he would leap upon the table, thus, and a friend sitting beside him leaned over, whispered something, and the speaker froze mid-gesture, sinking silently back into his chair. "And then," said the friend, taking up the narrative, "there was Boulard, the teetotum. I call him that because he was seized by a peculiar, if not entirely rational notion that he had been transformed into a spinning top. You would have roared to see him whirl. He would pivot on one heel for hours, spinning so. Before he could continue, another friend at his side repeated the same whispered intervention, halting him abruptly. "But then," cried an old lady, her voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the chatter, "your Monsieur Boulard was mad, and a very foolish madman at that. Who ever heard of a human teetotum? Preposterous! Why, Madame Joyeuse, though she had her quirks, possessed a sense and charm that gave delight to all who knew her." The room erupted into laughter again, the absurdity of the tales mingling with the elegance of the company. And yet, as I listened, a creeping unease stirred in me. There was a strange energy beneath the gaiety, an undercurrent of something uncanny, almost conspiratorial, threading through the laughter. I could not shake the sense that this dinner, these eccentricities, were only the prelude to a far more extraordinary revelation. She discovered, after careful reflection, that by some bizarre twist of fate she had become a chicken cock. Yet, as a proper chicken cock, she comported herself admirably. Her wings flapped with astonishing vigor, so, and her crow was nothing short of divine. Cock-a-doodle-doo, cock-a-doodle-doo, cock-a-doodle-doo-doo-doo. "Madame Joyeuse, I will thank you to behave yourself," thundered Monsieur Maillard, his face darkening with anger. "Either conduct yourself as a lady should, or leave the table immediately. Take your choice." The lady, whom I could scarcely believe was the same Madame Joyeuse she had been describing, blushed furiously, her face aflame to the eyebrows. She lowered her head in utter shame, silent under the rebuke. But the conversation did not end there. Another, younger lady, my beautiful acquaintance from the little parlor, eagerly resumed the tale. "Oh, Madame Joyeuse was a fool," she exclaimed, her voice bright and full of enthusiasm. "Yet there was a curious sort of reason behind Eugenie Salsafette's opinions. She was strikingly beautiful, painfully modest, and believed ordinary modes of dress to be scandalous. Her method of dressing, she insisted, was to step outside her garments rather than into them. It's quite simple, really. You just so, and then so, and then so, and then— "Mon Dieu, Mademoiselle Salsafette!" erupted a dozen voices at once. "What on earth are you doing? Forbear! That is quite enough. Hold! Several guests leapt from their seats, rushing to prevent her from performing what surely threatened to rival the Medicean Venus herself. Before anyone could intervene, a series of loud screams, wild, piercing, echoing from some distant wing of the chateau, suddenly halted the demonstration. The entire table froze. The absurdity, the chaos, the sheer unpredictability of the night had reached a crescendo. I felt a chill run down my spine, and yet a morbid curiosity compelled me to watch. Something extraordinary was about to unfold, something far beyond the whimsical eccentricities of this dinner. The piercing yells had shaken my nerves more than I cared to admit, but I couldn't help but feel genuine pity for the rest of the company. Never in my life had I seen a group of seemingly rational people so utterly terror-stricken. They paled to the color of corpses, shrinking into their chairs, trembling and gibbering, every ear straining for the next eruption of sound. And it came, louder, closer, a second time, then a third, deafening, and a fourth, though with noticeably less vigor. As the echoes faded, the terror that had gripped the room dissolved almost instantly. Conversation resumed, laughter and anecdotes flowing as if nothing had happened. Summoning my courage, I ventured to ask the cause of such commotion. "A mere bagatelle," said Monsieur Maillard, with a calm that belied the chaos. "We are accustomed to such things and care little. Occasionally the lunatics rise together in a howl, one setting off another, much like a pack of dogs at night. Sometimes these concerted yells are followed by an attempt to break free, at which point a small measure of danger may present itself." "And how many do you have in charge?" I inquired. "At present no more than 10 altogether." "Mostly women, I presume?" "Oh, no. Every one of them is a man, and stout fellows at that." "Indeed. I had always understood that lunacy favored the gentler sex," I said. "Generally so, but not always. Some time ago we had 27 patients, 18 of whom were women. But things have changed considerably, as you see." "Yes, have changed very much indeed," chimed in the entire company simultaneously, their voices echoing with a strange, almost conspiratorial unanimity. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The laughter, the absurdity, the chaos, all of it was beginning to take on a sinister undertone. Something told me that the true spectacle of this house was still yet to come. "Hold your tongues, every one of you," bellowed my host, his face flushed with anger. At once the entire company fell into a tense, almost eerie silence that lasted a full minute. One lady, taking his command literally, obediently stuck out her extraordinarily long tongue and, with a strange composure, held it there with both hands until the end of the spectacle. Leaning toward Monsieur Maillard, I whispered, "And this gentlewoman, this lady who just performed the cock-a-doodle-doo, she's harmless, I presume. Quite harmless, yes?" "Harmless?" he exclaimed, clearly astonished. Why, what could you mean by that?" "Only a touch of eccentricity, perhaps," I suggested, tapping my temple lightly. "I trust she is not dangerously deranged." "Mon Dieu, what is it you imagine?" he said, incredulous. "This lady, my dear old friend, Madame Joyeuse, is perfectly sane as I am. She has her little eccentricities, of course, but all elderly women do they not?" "To be sure," I murmured. "And the rest of these ladies and gentlemen?" "They are my friends and assistants," he declared, straightening with a proud hauteur. "My very good friends and my most capable assistants." "All of them?" I asked, incredulous. "The women, too?" "Assuredly," he replied. "We could manage nothing without them. The women are unmatched as nurses for the insane. Their bright, keen eyes, they possess a fascination almost hypnotic, like that of a serpent." Yes, I said, attempting casual agreement. "They do behave a little oddly, don't they? A little queer, eh?" "Odd? Queer?" he chuckled. "Do you really think so? We are not a prudish people here in the South. We live freely, enjoy life, and, well, all that sort of thing, you understand." Yes, I said again, nervously smiling. "And perhaps," he added with a sly glint in his eye, "this Clos de Vougeot is a bit heady, strong enough to make even the wisest of men a little less cautious, you understand." I nodded, though a chill ran down my spine. Beneath the polite smiles and laughter, an undercurrent of something dark and extraordinary was stirring, a secret that would soon erupt with astonishing force. "To be sure," I said, trying to maintain composure. "To be sure. By the way, monsieur, did I understand you correctly? This system you've adopted, replacing the famous soothing system, is it very rigorous?" "Not at all," he replied smoothly. "Our confinement is necessarily strict, of course, but the treatment itself, the medical side of things, is, I assure you, quite agreeable to the patients." "And this new system, is it entirely your own invention?" "Not entirely. Some elements come from Professor Tarr, of whom I imagine you've heard. Others are modifications I gladly attribute to the celebrated Professor Fether. You must know him intimately, I presume." "I am ashamed to admit," I confessed, "that I have never heard the names of either gentleman before."
Good heavens, my host exclaimed, springing back in his chair, hands thrown skyward. Surely you cannot mean it. Never heard of the learned Dr. Tarr or the celebrated Professor Fether? I am forced to confess my ignorance, I said humbly. But truth, as always, must be held inviolate. I shall seek out their works immediately and study them with the utmost care. Monsieur Maillard, you have truly made me feel humbled, indeed quite ashamed of myself. Say no more, my good young friend, he said warmly, pressing my hand. Join me now in a glass of sauternes. We drank. The company followed suit without hesitation. Conversation tumbled into chatter, jokes, and laughter, 1,000 absurdities erupting at once. The fiddles shrieked, the drum rowdied out, the trombones bellowed like the brazen bulls of Phalaris. Slowly, as the wine took hold, decorum melted away entirely, giving rise to a pandemonium in miniature, chaotic, raucous, and yet oddly mesmerizing. The room pulsed with life, with madness, and with an energy that seemed almost unnatural. I sat, glass in hand, watching the scene unfold, feeling that a revelation, shocking, unimaginable, was only moments away. The absurdity, I sensed, was only the prelude.
Meanwhile, Monsieur Maillard and I sat amidst several half-empty bottles of Sauternes and Vougeot, raising our voices to compete with the clamor around us. A word spoken normally might as well have been whispered from the bottom of Niagara Falls, completely lost in the chaos. "And, sir," I yelled into his ear, my words barely audible over the din, "you mentioned before dinner the dangers of the old soothing system. How exactly so?" "Yes," he bellowed back, "there was at times extreme danger. One can never predict the caprices of the mad. In my judgment, and that of Dr. Tarr and Professor Fether, it is never safe to let lunatics roam freely, unsupervised. They may be soothed for a while, but sooner or later their obstinacy emerges. Their cunning is legendary. If they have a plan, they hide it with astonishing skill. And the ease with which they feign sanity, it baffles even the most experienced metaphysician. When a lunatic seems perfectly rational, that is the very moment to think about a straitjacket." "But in your own experience," I shouted, "here, under your watch, was liberty truly hazardous?" "Here," he cried, eyes glinting, "you have no idea. Yes, most assuredly. Not long ago, under the soothing system, the patients were given freedom. They behaved impeccably, so well that anyone familiar with human nature would have suspected a plot. And sure enough, one fine morning the keepers awoke to find themselves bound hand and foot and thrown into the cells. And who attended them? The lunatics themselves, now masters of the house, running the asylum as if the keepers had become the patients." I recoiled, staring at him, the full horror sinking in. The absurdity of the dinner, the strange antics of the guests, the chaotic laughter, all of it had been a prelude. Behind the gilded madness, the house had a dark, cunning intelligence of its own, and the line between sanity and insanity was thinner than I could have imagined. "You don't say! I've never heard anything so utterly absurd in my life!" I exclaimed. "Ah, but it's true," Maillard said, leaning back with a sardonic smile. "It all began with a single lunatic, a particularly cunning fellow who fancied he had invented a system of government far superior to any ever conceived for the, governed lunatics. Naturally, he persuaded the rest of the patients to join his conspiracy, and together they overthrew the reigning authorities." "And he actually succeeded?" I asked, incredulous. "Without a doubt. The keepers were quickly overpowered, locked in cells, and, if I may be frank, treated rather cavalierly. The madmen, meanwhile, were free to roam, unshackled and unchallenged. But surely a counter-revolution must have occurred. The local villagers or any visitors would have raised the alarm." "You assume too much," Maillard replied, chuckling. "The head rebel was far too clever for that.
No visitors were admitted, except once for a foolish young gentleman, harmless enough so he was allowed in for sport. The lunatics amused themselves immensely, deceived him thoroughly, and then dismissed him with polite indifference. "And how long did this reign last?" I asked, my voice a whisper tinged with dread.
Oh, quite a long time. A full month, certainly, perhaps longer. During that period, the asylum became their playground. Shabby garments were discarded, the family wardrobe and jewels were plundered, and the cellars of the chateau, well stocked with wine, were emptied with commendable zeal. These lunatics, my friend, are devils at pleasure. They knew exactly how to live. And the treatment? What particular methods did the rebel leader employ? I ventured, bracing myself. Maillard's eyes gleamed, and he leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Ah, that, my friend, is the most extraordinary part of all." "Why, you see," Maillard began, "a madman is not necessarily a fool, as I have said before. And in truth, the treatment he devised, it was far superior to anything we had before. Simple, efficient, remarkably neat, almost delightful." But before he could finish, a fresh series of terrifying yells erupted, louder and closer than before. My heart leapt into my throat. "Gracious heavens!" I gasped. "The lunatics! They've broken loose!" Maillard paled to a ghostly white. I fear you are right," he stammered, just as thunderous shouts and imprecations rang out beneath the windows. The very air seemed alive with frenzy. The door shook violently, battered as if by a sledgehammer, and the shutters rattled as though a tempest had taken hold. Pandemonium descended. To my utter astonishment, Monsieur Maillard threw himself under the sideboard, utterly abandoning the dignity I had expected. The drunken orchestra, which had barely moved for the past 15 minutes, leapt to their instruments and scrambled atop the table, belting out Yankee Doodle with a deafening energy that bordered on supernatural. Across the dining table, amidst shattered bottles and spilled glasses, the previously restrained gentleman launched himself into an oration, his words utterly unintelligible, yet delivered with the gravity of a statesman addressing a parliament in flames. And then chaos incarnate. The man obsessed with being a human teetotum began spinning furiously around the room, arms extended at perfect right angles, knocking anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path off their feet. Glasses shattered, chairs toppled, and the pandemonium intensified to a crescendo of sound, fury, and laughter. Madness incarnate in full, chaotic display. In that instant, it became terrifyingly clear. The house was no longer ours. The lunatics were in command, and every convention of reason and order had been utterly, gloriously, and terrifyingly overturned. And then it began. A strange fizzing pop, like corks bursting one after another, drew my eyes to the human champagne bottle from dinner, performing his absurd mimicry with unrelenting energy. The frogman croaked, each note more desperate than the last, as if his very life depended on it. Over all rose the braying of a donkey, discordant and relentless. And poor Madame Joyeuse, my heart ached for her, stood frozen by the fireplace, utterly bewildered, letting out her endless cock-a-doodle-doo into the chaos. Then came the climax, the utter collapse of all reason. The 10 windows of the dining hall shattered simultaneously, sending shards of glass clattering to the floor. And through them poured a throng of creatures I could scarcely believe, leaping, howling, scratching, and trampling over everything in sight. Chimpanzees, orangutans, baboons from the Cape of Good Hope, or so my terror-addled mind imagined. I was immediately seized and beaten into submission, rolling under a sofa, my ears straining to catch the riot above me. 15 torturous minutes passed, and then the horrifying truth revealed itself. Monsieur Maillard's earlier stories of the rebellious lunatics were not tales at all. They were confessions of himself. He, the courteous, dignified superintendent I had admired, had become the very madness he described. A few years prior, he had been in charge of the asylum, but he went insane and the keepers were overthrown. 10 keepers, suddenly powerless, had been tarred, feathered, and imprisoned in underground cells while the patients reigned supreme. Every story I had heard of lunatic ingenuity, of absurd systems and human teetotums, was now terrifyingly real. The house, once a civilized asylum, had become a kingdom of chaos, where reason had been utterly subverted, and the rulers of this madhouse were the very men and women who should have been confined. For over a month the keepers had languished in their subterranean cells, subjected to Monsieur Maillard's unconventional treatment, tar and feathers, a daily deluge of water, and, mercifully, enough bread to survive. Each day the pump sent torrents crashing over them, a bizarre combination of punishment and absurd spectacle. Then, at last, a single clever escapee found the way through the sewer, and freedom was granted to the entire group. The madhouse erupted into normalcy once more, or as normal as it could ever be in a place like this. Monsieur Maillard, true to his peculiar genius, reinstated the old soothing system with a few modifications. Yet even he admitted with a hint of pride that his own chaotic reign had been remarkably effective, simple, neat, and entirely trouble-free, if applied on the proper scale. As for the legendary Dr. Tarr and Professor Fether, whose names haunted Parisian conversation and inspired curiosity across Europe, I have scoured every library I could find, yet their works remain elusive to this day. Perhaps like the lunatics themselves, they are more myth than reality, leaving behind only tales of ingenuity, absurdity, and the thin, trembling line between sanity and madness.
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.